Hi everyone, and welcome to my talk about a digital archive audit based on corpus use. To situate us all, I'm going to start with what I see as the problem here. So digital language corpora are very heterogeneous, and that, of course, in itself is not a problem. We expect corpora to be heterogeneous because they contain many different types of information. Many standards were formalized 15 years ago before much recent digital work was possible. So we can do things with our laptops in the field or in the classroom these days, which were not even thought of when many of our digital standards started to be formalized or informalized, as it were. Put that together with the fact that a lot of linguistic training, perhaps the majority of linguistic training in this area, focuses on producing material for archives and not working on materials from archives. Of course, not all is based on this trajectory, but the majority of it is. And so put that all together, and we don't really know if our collections are as useful as they could be. We don't know if we are doing things in the preparation of our digital corpora which make it more difficult to work with the corpora as corpora from archives. And we should be thinking about that now while we are still creating digital corpora, before the digital corpora are the only things that we have for many of the world's languages. And so my question for today is basically, can we do things better? As I mentioned before, linguists can run on their laptops in the field and in the classroom analyses that would have required rooms of specialized equipment 20 or 30 years ago, or may even not have been possible at all. So it's possible to do things with linguistic data that were unthought of when our documentation collections were originally created, both in terms of research and in terms of distributing and using language resources in reclamation, revitalization, and renewal. And so given this sort of situation, what can we do to make sure that we are making the best possible language archives for the future work that will need to happen for language reclamation, revitalization, renewal, as well as academic types of research? Now, of course, it's long been recognized. So I have a quote here from Bird and Simons, 2003, that producing linguistic corpora, particularly digital corpora, produces a whole bunch of other material as well. So Bird and Simons call this digital detritus of digital corpus creation, and they stress the need for archiving standards which are sensitive to corpus structure and corpus use. So this goes back to my point that we don't expect corpora to be heterogeneous, but what counts as digital detritus and what counts as integral parts of digital corpora are going to vary depending on the use to which they are put and the methods that are used to work with the linguistic data which is in the corpus. We might point out that there are probably differences between natively digital and digitized corpora as well. At this stage, we have a large collection of material which was digitized from earlier print sources. We should think about archives also as, are they the starting point of the research or are they the end point? So much work on what has been called the data life cycle see the data as or the archiving as the end point in a cycle, and they often overlook the role of archives and long-term sustainable data use. I can use an example of a certain linguistics textbook. This is the 2015 edition of my fieldwork book, where the send to archive portion of doing linguistic work is the endpoint in a well thought out process. And then, here it is at the end with no further arrows coming off it. And so if we think about data from archives as the input to language research rather than as the endpoint where things end up, what sorts of things happen? So a genuine data life cycle, not a life cycle with a particular endpoint. So this was the basis of the survey, an archival audit that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk, and that is still very much in the planning stages, and I'd very much like your feedback for it. This work is currently pending NSF funding. I'm hoping we'll hear any day about it. At the time of recording, we haven't heard, but maybe between now and the conference. The audit is currently in development over the course of this Northern Hemisphere spring. We'll be conducting it over 2021 to 2022. And our aim is to conduct an audit of accessible corpora in various digital archives, to work on the one hand, to work with field documentary linguists in an audit along as well, to gather further information about archival practices and additional collections. And as part of all this, to work with all stakeholders on collaborative outcomes. So our stakeholders will include, or do include, communities, archivists, linguists, others who have a stake in making the best possible digital archives that we can. And I should also say that while I have called this an archival audit, the audit portion of this is not aimed at being punitive or pointing out errors or gotchas or anything like that. It's simply seeing the range of things that people do as part of making digital collections and digital linguistic archives, and what sorts of practices could be either widely adopted or changed to make sure that we have the best possible archives that we can make. Okay, so our aims are basically to answer these sorts of questions here. So how we have 5 main aims here. So how does current archival data work as an input to research rather than the final output? So what sorts of things do we need to take into account when we treat this material as an input to research rather than an output? What happens when we work on other people's collections rather than the collections we have ourselves created? Second point, what current archiving practices facilitate or impede the use of digital corpora, both digitized corpora and natively digital materials? So what sorts of things are we doing really well that should be more widely adopted? What sorts of things do we do that actually impede the use of our corpora, that make it more difficult to use the corpora than they should otherwise be? What additional cyber infrastructure tools are needed? Do we have the cyber infrastructure tools, the methods of working with these digital materials to do the things that we want to do, the things that we need to do, the things that we can imagine doing, and what other things do we need that we don't currently have? Fourthly, how do we build community-oriented resources for language research, for language teaching, and for language reclamation from these corpora? And how do we make these a part of the process of linguistic research, rather than either not done at all or tacked on the end or left as a project for the future if possible as time permits. So one of the, of course, good things about doing things digitally is that it should be possible to make it should be much easier to convert materials to different formats for different audiences and so on. But of course, that requires some thought. So what we're looking at here is how to build that in right from the start. So we're not producing linguist-oriented materials or academic-oriented materials and then making the language community-oriented materials a kind of optional extra. And finally, how can these corpora sustainably serve language documentation aims and language reclamation? So as part of our digital practices at the moment, what are we doing that makes these corpora sustainable, and what sorts of things can we do better? And I treat as part of this also the potential things that we need to think about as we create more digital resources. Do they come back into the archives appropriately, and things like that as well? I see that as part of sustainability as well. Okay, so what does the survey look like? I'm just going to present it very briefly here, general sorts of overviews. I do have a link here to the Open Science Framework for our current general plans, and these have the general sorts of questions that we will be focused on for each of the areas of our survey plan and our audit along. And so you're welcome to click on that. I'll have it again at the end for you to have a look at what we're doing. Happy to answer any questions about this in the question period, of course, as well. We have 5 areas for the plan for the survey. We plan to spend roughly 1 to 2 months on each of these areas and then wrap things up at the end of the year. So 5 areas, 2 months is 10 months, and then a month in the middle to catch up and a month at the end to disseminate the materials. So first of all is the format and the scope of the collections, including the metadata. These are things like what is in the collections, what sorts of things are people collecting, how are those materials linked to one another, can we find the things that we need to find, can we find all the materials from a particular speaker, for example, is the material complete according to the inventory, and all of those sorts of things. Secondly, we want to work with sound files and look at the sorts of things that we can do with sound files. So for instance, can we force align at the segment level transcripts that are included in the collection? If the materials are already forced aligned at the utterance level, what sorts of things can be done to force align them in more detail to produce, say, a phonetic sketch of the language? In working with print materials, we're interested in things like producing a part of speech tagged corpus, or putting materials into Flex to produce a basic dictionary, things like that. For section 4, we're working with particularly producing community-oriented language materials, things like talking dictionaries or semantic domain-based materials for vocabulary building, pedagogical materials, things like that. And in the 5th part, we're thinking about sustainability, re-archiving, what sorts of things in this collection might age out and be inaccessible in the future, things like that. Okay, our preliminary results, so we only have very preliminary results yet. We haven't started the formal survey, but we do have some indication that a survey like this is badly needed. For example, in work with my student, Sarah Babinski, who is also talking in the PARADISEC session, in one of the other sessions here on forced alignment, in her work with corpora from a number of different digital corpora, as well as my work with the Chirilla database, we found that pre-processing of corpora from archives is not at all straightforward, and that first-hand knowledge in some cases of the corpora are needed in order to work with them. And we'll be talking about this at ICLDC. We find things like missing crucial settings files or unlinked metadata, unexplained conventions that in some cases recoverable, but also make working with the corpora much more difficult than it should be. We find things like empty transcripts, which make it unclear whether there was an error in the upload to the digital archive, or whether these files haven't actually been transcribed yet. So things along those lines. We find things like many structures for different types of structured files. For example, ELAN transcripts can be structured in many different ways, and that's part of the structured data that ELAN produces. But when these files are structured in different ways, that produces issues for computational output and computational work with those files. We find databases that had structure archived in unstructured ways. So for instance, archiving the PDFs or the Word documents that are outputs to dictionaries, not the underlying structured database itself. And we find things around differences in digital audio formats, some of which make a difference for future phonetic work, although of course some of them do not. And Sankar et al. Submitted is an example of a discussion of that sort of work. So in conclusion, at this point, given where we are in this stage, very much in the planning process, feedback is extremely welcome for this sort of work. Volunteers for corpora collections we should look at in particular, volunteers of data are extremely welcome. Please let us know what you would like to test. Please let us know things that you've noticed in working with digital corpora yourself. Please let us know the sorts of things you'd like to be able to do with corpora that we can potentially work into our methods. Please let us know about your own experiences, as I mentioned, and please also look for more information about this project throughout the year. And so with that, thank you very much, and I'll turn back to my live self to take any questions.